First of all, let's say that what China has done is truly a phenomenon that deserves everyone's admiration. China is transforming and upending the world in ways that will be central to our experience for the foreseeable future. To be more accurate, it deserves balanced attention that aims to understand what is happening rather than propagandistically painting them negatively so that we in the West appear better by comparison. Acknowledgement of that fact, what I mean is that this is the greatest story of economic growth that we have likely ever had in the history of humanity. Before 70 years ago, this country had the largest population in the world, with well over 1 billion and nearly 1.5 billion people living in unimaginable poverty. In those 70 years, this country has lifted at least 1 billion of those people out of extreme poverty and into the modern world. Population that has never been done before. If you combine all of Europe, which has a quarter of China's population, it took them 200 to 300 years to achieve anything like China's economic growth record in just 7 decades. Many other aspects of China are less remarkable. There are undoubtedly both positive and negative aspects to economic progress, but when it comes to escaping poverty and creating a contemporary economic reality in terms of the creation and distribution of goods the People's Republic of China is the only exceptional performer who comes close to achieving that goal, which is the main objective of the majority of people on the planet and has been for the past 70 years. Regardless of what else you may think about or just sidestep this society, acting as though what I just said isn't true will not improve your understanding. On the contrary, it will worsen it. In addition, there are other ways that this society is different and unique, such as the fact that it's not like the competition that the United States has with other capitalist nations, and we are currently in competition with China. While China and its allies are the so-called BRICS on the one hand, the United States and Western Europe are on the other, and China is actually outproducing the United States in a number of commodities. President Biden is investing in semiconductor chips because China has reached technological levels of competence that the U.S. is finding extremely difficult to match. We have a 27.5% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles because they are the most popular in the world right now in terms of both price and quality. There is fierce competition, but it's unlike anything the U.S. has ever faced because, unlike other capitalist nations like Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan, the competition now comes from a society that calls itself socialist rather than capitalist and has a significant role for the government. It is also a competition that differs from the one the United States had with the Soviet Union because China has openly welcomed capitalist enterprises to develop inside China for more than half of the last 70 years, both those owned and operated by Chinese individuals and private capitalist enterprises, and those brought over from Western Europe, Japan, and the United States. For a communist party that is obviously in charge, that is new, different, and going to produce different outcomes. Sector accounts for almost half of the economy, while the state sector the other half of this is different from anything that existed in the relationship between the U.S. and the USSR, so you have a strange relationship. The U.S. and China collaborate economically more than ever before, but there is also economic competition that is far more intense than there was between the U.S. and the USSR. To put it another way, the Chinese experience, particularly in its relationships with the United States and the wider private capitalist world of Western Europe, North America, and Japan are unique in many ways, and that must be understood given that China is currently the second most developed and powerful influence on the global economy and may very well be the leading shaper of global economic events before the end of this decade. As always, we must study history in order to comprehend this remarkable accomplishment and the extraordinary reality that we live in. The first half of today's program is intended to prepare us for understanding China's politics and economy. Today, Xi Jinping, the country's current leader, talks about a century of humiliation that lasted from about 1850 to 1950. During this time, China felt humiliated both then and now, as Western nations, in particular, seized parts of China, fought wars, occupied entire cities, and plunged the country into extreme poverty. Bigger than anything they had ever witnessed, yet complete colonialism had never occurred. You have a mixture of humiliation and independence because China maintained its independence in contrast to countries like India, Indonesia, most of Africa, and so forth. No Europeans or settler colonists ever settled in large parts of China. Although they did have locations in coastal cities, they never occupied the nation as they did in South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, the United States, or Canada, and I could go on to more contemporary countries once the 20th century was filled with incredibly fascinating events that occurred almost simultaneously. The Europeans united in the Boxer Rebellion, a final war that defeated the Chinese, to deliver a devastating blow and demonstrate their dominance even if they did not establish a colonial relationship. Not surprisingly, a few years after the Soviet Revolution in Russia in 1917, the Chinese also underwent a revolution. Chinese communists, partly inspired by the Russian Revolution, started the Long War. After the Boxer Revolution, the Western powers reportedly hoped to develop a more complacent subordinated capitalism in China, but their plans were defeated. A civil war brought the communists to victory in 1949, and they were in an alliance with the Soviet Union from 1949 to about 1960. March marked the beginning of the movement led by Mao that would ultimately result in the Communist Party and its army defeating the friendly West Army of Chiang Kai-shek in 1949. Then, after the Soviet Union and China broke up after a bitter, difficult, and occasionally even violent conflict, the Chinese developed their own version of socialism that was different from that of the Soviets in Russia. Yes, socialism comes in many forms, and over the past 60 years, China has developed its own unique brand of socialism or communism, depending on which word you think is more appropriate. It was during these last 60 years, especially the last 40 or so, that the accomplishments with which I started today's program were made. Great nation, it evolved into a Chinese-style socialism. As we move on to the second half of today's program, I'm going to go into them, but I want to emphasize that the Chinese made it their mission to prioritize becoming once again the unhumble powerful enough, wealthy enough, and productive enough to avoid being humiliated by the West. Their main theme is that they have achieved economic growth that, if we use the measure, has been nothing short of stupendous.